Hello, good morning, everyone. I think it's time to start. Um, a lot of you have already entered the room. There will probably be another 50 to 100 people joining throughout the first minutes, but we can already start. Thanks a lot, everyone, this morning to join our Decade of Netflix in Europe seminar, a webinar that we would have liked to do on the physical premises of the VUB, but you all know why it's not possible. We will present you a number of presentation based on academic research from within the team of SMIT connected to imec and the VUB. And we've also invited Professor Catherine Johnson from University of Huddersfield to also shed some light on future research developments and challenges with regards to platforms and SVODs in particular. Let me start off by just saying, by just showing a picture, basically showing the first Netflix original that was launched in Europe. It was an NRK, Public Service Broadcasting, Netflix collaboration, a co-production centered around Steve Van Zandt. And with it also came the first steps of Netflix, the first global SVOD entering the European market in 2012. In 2013, after UK, Norway, and a limited number of countries, immediately after 2013, a number of other countries followed, such as the Netherlands. And a year after that, we've had Netflix being introduced in Belgium as well. And since then, gradually in the rest of Europe. If we look at the figures, Netflix has become a very important player in Europe, and SVODs in general have become important. I think this is a graph from the European Audiovisual Observatory that has been distributed widely over the past couple of months, showing the enormous increase in broadband penetration, digitization of content. It shows the EU 28 SVOD and TVOD consumer revenues and showing a sharp increase of 40% between 2010 and 2020. Now, we have to put this in perspective, of course. We have to also look at the totality. What does SVOD and TVOD mean in the totality of financing across Europe? And then we notice that advertisement and public funding, so that means public service media, pay TV, are still by far the most important investors in original content. However, SVOD and TVOD, so TVOD is transactional video on demand, SVOD is subscription video on demand, which is Disney Plus, Amazon, Netflix. They have also taken in quite a big portion of the cake in terms of financing and audio and revenues. This graph shows the revenues and shows that SVODs account for 6% of the total revenue of audiovisual markets in Europe. Now, from a research perspective, a lot of interesting questions pop up here. The first one is a question on investment in domestic content. How do SVODs invest in local European content? Do they invest in local European content? How does local content circulate? What is the impact of having catalogs with lots of content from different countries in a small market like Flanders? What do we get to see in these catalogs of different streamers? What happens to new viewing habits? What is the impact of binge watching? What is the impact of shifting media use on existing players? Is it cannibalizing cinema? Is it cannibalizing viewing rates of television broadcasters? Then there's a question on fair authors' rights remuneration. What does exploiting content mean in a global marketplace for authors? Does it also mean that authors, being screenwriters, directors, music composers, and so on, do authors also get remunerated from international exploitation on these platforms? Fifth, there's the question of prominence of content, the discoverability. How prominent is European content visible within these catalogs. And then 6, there's the question of media policy and how effective existing measures are to deal with the challenges that come with the advent of players like Netflix. So what do we want to do today? Basically, we want to set up a research dialogue on the impact of SVODs and present a more nuanced discussion on the impact of SVODs. So we both look at the advantages that the entrance of Netflix had in the European market, as well as the challenges and potential pitfalls. We focus on European markets, but we have a particular interest in small markets, and with small markets, I usually refer to countries smaller than a population of 10 million. And we look at this from different perspectives. We present perspectives from production view, distribution view, audience view, and a policy view. We focus on evidence. So we don't want to spend too much time on theoretical conceptualization, which is also a big chunk of academic research with regard to SVODs, but we want to present recent evidence from ongoing and just finished research that we've done over the past year. We do this from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. So that means lots of mapping, lots of catalog mapping, but also interviews, frame analysis, and so on. And we also look at, we want to present these insights that we think also have repercussions for domestic players, domestic producers, broadcasters, distributors, as well as policymakers. From an academic point of view, we also want to see this as a starting point for potential further collaborations. Lots of researchers around the globe are currently mapping catalogs, are looking into financing of players like Netflix, especially because SVODs has also presented some trickiness in the sense that data is very inaccessible for research. So we've kind of come up with creative ways to look at patterns of SVODs. Collaboration in that is very important. So why do we focus on Netflix, and why did we call this the Netflix webinar? Basically because it's the biggest SVOD on the European market, but it also has become a symbol for global trends affecting audiovisual production. Even in such a way that some of the investment obligations in a lot of countries have been dubbed Netflix taxes, where they're actually not only aimed at Netflix, and they're definitely not real taxes. Netflix has also been the front runner in development on platformization, and the impact of players like Netflix in small markets has become more visible than other players' impact, such as Disney Plus and Amazon Prime at this point. We're quite sure that in a few years' time, we might be able to do a webinar on Amazon, Disney, or HBO Max, or maybe some Asian platforms. And lastly, data is more accessible for research, which also allows us to better study and capture patterns associated with SVODs. Where did we do this research? All research is conducted within SMIT, and SMIT is a research department that is linked to both imec and the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, the VUB. And we've done this research in one of the two big programs of SMIT, which is the Media and Society program, which hosts approximately 45 researchers. We look at SVODs in our unit, the Media Economics and Policy unit, from the perspective of sustainability. What makes audiovisual content sustainable? What are the needs to have audiovisual healthy ecosystems, and what does it mean to be healthy in a small market where you're very dependent on public funding? So we look at the impact on SVODs on small markets, how they reshape production, distribution, and consumption, which different patterns and trends occur in how these players market and positions themselves, and the effectiveness and desirability of policy measures to deal with the challenges. And we do this in a variety of research tracks, both applied and fundamental. This is the Netflix team within SMIT. I'm probably forgetting some people, but these are the people from the Media Economics and Policy unit that have been working on the topic of Netflix. On the left-hand side, you see the senior researchers. that have been covering topics on platform diversity, clusters, small media markets, as well as research on market entry strategy of platforms across different markets. My own research mostly focuses on the impact of policy measures and what it means indeed to be sustainable from a theoretical and practical point of view. On the right-hand side, you see a number of names of people who will all present here today. Eline Livemont will also be the host of the webinar after I stop talking. Her work focuses on documentary production and distribution in VOD. Ivana Kostovska works on sustainability of media ecosystems and the effectiveness of support policies. Catalina Jordake works on global patterns of SVOD production and distribution. Stephanie Tintel works on film and how SVODs reshape viewing habits and how SVODs have reshaped theatrical releases. Axel Asmar works on SVODs reshaping cultural identity and diversity, especially from the perspective of young audiences. And then lastly, Adelaida Filipoi works on platforms and European policymakers' effectiveness in dealing with platforms in a couple of domains, such as signal integrity, competition, and prominence. This is the program of today. After this introduction, I will immediately start, because we're already going over time, with the first presentation. What does it mean to be a small market? Then after that, we introduce the Netflix original and we present research on what it meant for production of European television content. At 10:20, we present a European comparison of obligations on VOD platforms, which is a report that was just finished yesterday evening. The report will also be, of course, made available. Then we have a break. And then afterwards, we look at patterns in streaming behavior, where we present the results of a recent survey that we did on the return to Belgian cinemas and how streaming behavior changed during lockdown. After that, we focus on diversity and how Netflix has branded diversity as a corporate strategy. Then we look at the local platforms and we take a look at the catalogs of local players, Streams, VTM Go, Go Play, Sooner, and comparison with the big catalogs of players like Netflix. And then finally, we end up with some key questions in research on platforms and SVODs presented by Catherine Johnson. All the presentations will be made available on the SMIT website, so no need to make too many screenshots or copy paste or just copy text. There will also be a recording of the webinar that is made available afterwards. There is, as you can see, we have quite a strict program. We wanted just to give you a lot of information. There is time after each presentation for a limited number of questions. I would suggest that you keep the questions in the chat for after the presentation. If you do want to take the mic, you're obviously allowed to, but let's save the questions for after the presentation. More info and details are available and will be distributed. So if there is a report available on a specific topic, it will also be mentioned, and then you can find it on the SMIT website or on our newsletter. If you want to tweet about this, there's a hashtag. And if you want to know more about the research team, then the bios and summaries are available on the SMIT website. That's it for now. Let me immediately start with the first introduction. Small markets, and what do we talk about when we talk about small markets? This, most of you already know, and there's pressure on existing business models of free-to-air broadcasters in Europe. There is delayed viewing, there is ad skipping, and that has been increasing over the past 2 decades. There is also a shift to online ad spending. Players like Facebook and Google have taken large chunks of the advertisement spending, money that used to be invested in legacy media companies. So traditional broadcasters have been facing competition from 2 sides. Then there's obviously the big revolution in shifted media use, where traditional media players are confronted with not only new types of devices, but all kinds of new services, new types of viewing habits, especially with younger audiences. And then there is the introduction of SVODs as a game changer in the global media market. SVODs can be considered platforms. And if we look at what platforms are, platforms challenge existing business models. They do this in a couple of ways. One way is to use integration and control. And the idea is by knowing much more about the users and datifying the business model, there is a much clearer, a much more direct relationship with the consumer. The second aspect is scale and diversification. Platforms, if they want to be successful, need to be big. Platforms need to diversify their offer, and platforms also need to be present on an enormous scale. This enormous scale also creates enormous advantages in terms of investment, in terms of return on investments. Why do you need enormous scale? Because content obviously costs a lot of money. And we do see that the content that is available on SVODs and these global platforms is content that is usually exclusive. We're seeing a big shift, an actual paradigm shift, going from a distributor or a player offering content catalogs based on license deals to a platformization of the media ecosystem based on exclusive content and an extreme hunt for rights and catalog. I think we've all know examples of recent mergers and takeovers. Amazon MGM deal was the last one. This obviously fits within a strategy of Amazon trying to secure the titles and productions of MGM and try to create a closed circuit in which MGM makes deals for movies with Amazon, and aside of that, releases a number of titles on their own in cinema, and the rest on their own platform. If you would have to summarize the characteristics of winning a platform war, because it has become, and the platforms war has become a streaming war, there are actually 4 key deterministics as defined by Tom Evers and Karen Donders. You can summarize them in 4 C's, basically content, connectivity, customer, and capital. So if we want to become a platform ourselves and develop domestic success, we need to take into account these 4 distinguishing features if we want to win a streaming war. Aside of that, there's obviously the contextual factors such as policy and regulation, the economic climate, and technological penetration, which plays an enormous role in the success of a specific platform. This has become the key mantra for a lot of platforms, and the company that makes a show can also ensure that nobody else gets it. Discussions on rights acquisitions of series like Friends, the hunt for all kinds of exclusive content can be contextualized within that new mantra, which is characteristic for platformization on the global marketplace. Now, you wouldn't say it, but because we're confronted with an explosion of new scripted content every day. But if you look at the total offering of domestic content, we do see a decrease. These are numbers from Ofcom highlighting the UK situation, where you see a clear decrease of PSB channel output. So that is first run original content on broadcasters. So broadcasters' domestic offerings are under pressure, partly as a consequence of the entrance of SVODs and the competition with SVODs in the market. So on the one hand, you could say there are a number of opportunities for local players to expand the scope, to increase revenue. And local producers now have a chance to sell content to more players than ever before, to strike interesting deals that immediately cover multiple territories, that increase revenue, and that lead to interesting co-production deals. Yet, and this is also clear, all these recoupment and all these deals are rarely sufficient to recoup all investments, especially in small markets. Another consequence, and this is the downside, is if you have to share exclusivity with a number of other players in a business model, for example, an SVOD player working together with a broadcaster, then you get a fragmentation of financing. The ideal would be that the totality of all players investing leads to bigger budgets. Bigger budgets also leads to more chances internationally, also usually leads to higher quality. Having more players involved cannot lead to more fragmentation. This is one of the key challenges. Another key challenge is that we see an explosion in the same genre. Flanders has been producing an average between 12 and 20 scripted television shows annually. For small markets, this is very big. We're coming from a time when Denmark, Sweden, Norway were producing on average 4 to 5 scripted shows annually. What we see is that we see an increase multiplied by 5 in the Nordic countries as well. So what we see is that there is increased competition on the European marketplace for scripted content. And it is exactly this scripted content that is the key differentiator for local players, and that is the most attractive to sell to players like Netflix. There's also pressure on existing windows. COVID obviously didn't help, and COVID questioned actual windowing systems, for example, by immediately showing or fast tracking films on streaming platforms without being shown in cinema. Whether this will be a new trend or just a temporary trend, we don't know yet. We do see signs that, and we do feel that the pressure of players like Netflix and other SVODs has been pressurizing at least the time of the cinema window and other windows. There's also an increase, as I said, a competition for rights acquisition, and that is also coming as a disadvantage for traditional broadcasters. A lot of broadcasting content is not domestic content, it's a license deal content. But if we see that international platforms and big media players, big studios like Warner, like Paramount, like Disney, are becoming platforms themselves and are being available on the local market, then it becomes more difficult for a player like VRT, for example, in Belgium, to still get interesting rights deals for HBO content, for Hulu content, and for other content. This is, by the way, not only visible in Belgium, but is happening on a global scale as well. Now, what did legacy media players do as a reaction in Europe? Firstly, there is increased competition, but this led to increased mergers. We see a couple of mergers between service providers, distributors, as well as broadcasters, distributors merging or taking over production companies, all in attempts to secure rights, to secure investments, and to secure, to some extent, exclusivity. For a lot of players, like local distributors and pay TV offerings, it has become as important to identify yourself with local content as it has for broadcasters. Because also for players like Telenet, differentiating from Netflix, Amazon, and the others has become important. Broadcasters have tried to, from their side, have tried to diversify, have tried to focus on live content, event content, the content that cannot be watched in ad skipping or delayed viewing. They have also been focusing on specific types of local content, which is mostly scripted. This, ironically, puts even more pressure on already fragile business models. What we also see with domestic players is that they have been shifting to VOD as well. Players like VTM, for example, Vier, now Play 4, have been experimenting with VOD platforms for a while now, but now we see since 2020 a real platformization of these broadcasters as well. VTM Go is no longer an extra service, it becomes more and more a key form of revenue in the Flemish markets. Same for VRT Nu as a public broadcaster. Fifth, there's also interesting collaborations with global players. We're often considering global players as enemies, but they have become important partners as well. For a lot of production companies like the Manson, like Caviar, international platforms have become interesting partners to sell content or to co-finance content with. And sixth, we've seen an uptake of domestic SVOD collaborations as well in Europe. We've been talking about a Flemish Netflix for 5 years. Since September 2020, we have our own Flemish Netflix called Streams. A lot of countries are following suit. A lot of interesting domestic SVOD alternatives pop up. One of the more successful streaming alternatives, European alternatives, is Viaplay in the Scandinavian markets. The Netherlands has Videoland. In the French market, Salto was launched as a collaboration between TF1 and M6. And in a couple of other markets, these SVOD collaborations have been taking place as well. What did governments do? Well, we do see more or less 3 shifts. We see an uptake in economic incentives. We see the rise of tax incentives and all kinds of economic incentives to boost local production. While at the same time, I also somehow ironically, there have been huge cuts on public broadcasting funding. And as we know from all kinds of analysis, public broadcasters are still in most small markets the most important investor in audiovisual content. Second, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the European directive, now allows member states to impose investment obligations, and there is the much talked about 30% quota for European works on catalogs, also not only domestic on-demand players, but also global players targeting a domestic market. Lastly, governments are increasingly exploring regulation or at least codes and guidelines for assuring prominence of European content. What this prominence means still goes in a lot of ways. Lastly, what does this all mean for small markets? In small markets, we have a limited number of players. That means that usually you have a situation where you have quite a fragmented production market with a lot of very small players, but only very few commissioners. In large markets, there are more commissioners, and these commissioners are also pay TV operators, SVODs, and they have been traditionally more diverse than in small markets. In small markets, you're dependent on, like Flanders, 2 to 3 broadcasters commissioning content. And if we know that broadcasters face enormous challenges, that means that for producers and for independent production, the situation becomes even more fragile. Small markets are usually characterized by a limited home market and limited domestic recoupment. And domestic recoupment, domestic success, is also the key for international success. So if you have limited domestic success and add that to the riskiness of investing, then we do see on the European market a limited risk-taking and less private investment than, for example, in larger markets. In larger markets in the US, best example, studios invest much more upfront in films and television series because they're much more certain that a specific title will work internationally. Adding to that, the result of that is that we work with smaller budgets, but we are required to compete in the same marketplace as big budget productions. Netflix, for a Netflix viewer, whether a series costs 100 million euros to make or whether it only costs 10 million euros is not important. The quality of the series is important. So if you have smaller budgets, that also means that technically, at least theoretically, there is less capacity for international export, and you have a larger dependency of public support. Added to that are the cultural differences that characterize Europe. We're not that used to watching a Polish series in Flanders and vice versa. So that means that traditionally circulation of content within Europe is problematic. This graph shows the difference between the public funding percentages in film between small markets and large markets. And you see that in small markets, 54% is direct public funding. In large markets, it's only 20%. So size does matter. Here you see a graph showing the top fiction producing countries, data by the European Audiovisual Observatory, and you do see the big five popping up there. Poland and the Netherlands have also become important producers of television fiction and have traditionally invested in large portions of fiction. So small markets, and it's not only a negative story, small markets are not doomed to stay small. What we have seen since 2016 and since the selling of the Flemish series Salamander to BBC, we saw an enormous uptake of exports of Flemish content around the globe, including interesting deals with players like Netflix as well. Series like Thieves of the Wood, Over Water, The 12, Hotel Beau Séjour are all available, Tabula Rasa are all available on Netflix. And with Undercover, we also have an actual Netflix original. So lastly, what are then the key challenges for SVODs in small markets? As a summary, one, there's the pressure on the main financiers of television content. Second, there are the difficulties for local platforms to build scale and take the advantages of platformization that big players have. Thirdly, we do think and we do witness that global players are more likely to invest in larger markets simply because it's less risky to invest in a French title and a German title than a Belgian title, at least a Flemish title, because you're already assured from a much bigger audience than in a small market. And fourthly, realizing profits and revenue that surpass what you put into it as a public incentive is an exception rather than the rule. Even the most successful title in Flanders that has been available on more than 100 territories still did not succeed in recouping all the money. So that means that from a policy point of view, investing in audiovisual ecosystems is always a policy choice. And I think a very important one, of course. This is the end of my presentation. I will immediately give the floor to Adelaida, who will introduce the first batch of evidence based on an analysis we did on Netflix originals. After that, we have time for some questions. Adelaida, you have the floor.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for joining to our presentations, and thank you, Professor Ratz, for the introductory slides. I'm a third-year PhD researcher at imec-SMIT VB, where I focus on, as my colleague said before, on platformization and how policymakers are dealing with platforms. Today I will present to you the Netflix original and what that means for the production of European television content. So the study's goal was to analyze Netflix's original investments in European scripted series, and by scripted series we mean episodic fiction that lasts for at least 20 minutes and that also includes sitcoms and mini-series. Much research that we see on Netflix today mostly looks at the composition of Netflix catalogs and also more recently work on prominence and visibility. But what we don't know is their investment strategies and what patterns they take. And that's partly because these investments are taking place at a very fast pace, and also because budget data is not really available. But what we do know for sure is that, yes?
I will interrupt you because we cannot see your slides.
Oh.
Yes.
Like at all?
At all. We just see the VUB Ola.
Oh.
Maybe you paused the screen sharing.
Okay, 1 second. I'm sorry.
Yes, now we see it, and yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. So what we do know for sure now is that the full originals are usually the more expensive types of series, and that we use this as a proxy to say something about the Netflix original budgets patterns. Now Netflix's presence and the deals that they strike, they impact the European production landscape. And as Professor Ras was saying before, this really affects the way the audiovisual market works in Europe. We put together a database based on a quantitative mapping that we did on the Netflix investments in the scripted series. We looked at the countries part of the continent, so that also includes Russia and Iceland. The database includes titles starting from 2012, which marks the first year a Netflix original was released in Europe by Netflix, and that was the Lillehammer in Norway, which was a co-production with the public broadcaster NRK. And our database comprised of 176 original titles. We complemented this data, and in order to put this data together, we looked at secondary sources. So that was trade publications like Hollywood Reporter, The Verge, Deadline, but also we looked at Netflix Media Center, which is an up-to-date release information on their series. And also we consulted the IMDb Pro in order to get information on production companies, release dates, and so on. And we supplemented this with looking at certain databases, such as what's on Netflix. So an original content is basically an exclusive title that is distributed worldwide or in specific territories. And we know that they're the most present in catalogs. And we can identify them by looking at the end logo that is present on their cover. By looking at the secondary sources and trade publications, we managed to put together a list of production companies involved in the specific series, release dates, and production partners. And we managed to categorize these 176 titles into 4 types of investments. I will quickly go through the 4 types, starting by the licensed originals. And these are the types of originals where Netflix gets the distribution rights, and they do not contribute to the production budget. And usually the series is not marked as an original in the country of origin. Then in terms of the continuation deals, we see 2 different strategies. So the first one is the case of Lovesick, for example, where Netflix acquires a license for worldwide rights. And then after the release of the first season, they contribute to the production budget. Then the second one, the second strategy that is also one of the most common ones is that Netflix takes over the production entirely. So we saw this being the case with Black Mirror, where Netflix outbid the public broadcaster, Channel 4, for the rights for Black Mirror. Or for example, Money Heist, the Spanish series where the series was canceled, but Netflix picked it up. Then in terms of the co-production and co-financing originals, we see that the reason why we discuss them together is because we do not have enough data on release dates, revenues, editorial control, so we cannot really place the series in an exact typology. But we do know that for a co-production, such as Lillehammer, the ownership rights are split between the production companies, and that also allows for a more creative leeway. Then for the co-financing, we see that Netflix contributes financially at the initial production stage in return for worldwide distribution, right? And one of the cases was with the series Undercover. And we have the full originals, which, as I mentioned before, are the ones that receive the most budgets from Netflix. And in this case, Netflix commissions independent production companies, which do not have any rights over the content. So going to the second part of our findings, We see an exponential increase starting 2012 until 2020 of new titles that were original titles that were released. We see that 2020 is shy of 2019 number of titles, and that is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. From our database, we saw that around 30 series that we did not include in this graph, 30 series were postponed for a later release. And if they would have been released, then the increase could have, we could have seen an increase also in the 2020 column. Netflix made use of licensed and continuation deals to enter the European market. As Professor Ras was mentioning before about it's the reason for getting access to local offerings and limiting their investment risk. And we saw that being the strategy in the first 4 years of their presence in Europe. We see that full originals are preferred because of the growing importance of exclusive rights. Whereas we see the decline of the other 3 types being present as well. In terms of volume of minutes per year, in which we calculated the released seasons for each of the year, we see that despite the lower number in originals in 2020, in terms of volume of minutes, we see that they are higher than in 2019. And that is partly because Netflix released new seasons and not necessarily because of the addition of the new titles that were released in 2020. In 2019, we see that the full originals actually overcome the minutes of co-production and co-financing originals, and continuation originals see a slight decrease, but bear in mind 2020 had no continuation deals in place whatsoever. In terms of the country diversity, we can see the first 5 countries are actually the big 5 in Europe, and they also represent large language markets. So from overall the 176 titles, 80% were originating from the big 5. Overall, 30% originated in the UK, so we can see, as in the graph, preference for British series. We see that small countries receive less investments, and Belgium has the highest number of titles from the small markets. Co-production and co-financing are more common in smaller markets, and we see that Eastern and Central Europe receives less investments, but that is about to change because recent reports show that the Central and Eastern Europe is actually a booming market and is the fastest growing in terms of SVOD investments. And that can be clarified by Netflix already being present in Poland and Russia. In terms of volume in minutes per investment type, we see there are huge discrepancies between the first 2 countries, UK and Spain, and the rest of the countries. If we go back to the other slide, we see that the number of UK titles is almost double the number of Spanish titles. But in terms of volume of minutes, they are quite similar. And that is because Netflix chooses different formats for each market. In UK, there are more titles that have short form than in Spain. In terms of the genre distribution, we see that there is diversity across all 4 investment types. There is a preference for drama in full originals and also for crime in licensed originals and co-production and co-financing originals, and comedy is preferred for continuation deals. And looking at the co-production and co-financing partners, we see that 80% of these originals are produced with public broadcasters, with the exception of Spain, where the private broadcasters are more involved in these types of investments than public broadcasters. Also, we see that in several markets, the same partners are preferred for these types of deals. So some of the key lessons that we can take away from this presentation is that there has been an uptake in Netflix investments in European content, and the big 5 received the highest investments both in titles and in minutes, which actually reinforces the discrepancies that we see in the European audiovisual market, where there is a big difference between large markets and smaller markets. Public service broadcasters are Netflix's preferred partners, who are also known for their strong reputation as investors in local content. So that is also reinforced. There has been a clear shift from licensed originals to full Netflix originals in order to retain all rights. And this is part of the context of the streaming wars. And the investments in pan-European productions is quite non-existent. And that is contrary to what is believed to be a solution for a better content circulation. Also, one thing to mention is that the investments are not restricted by genre. As we saw in the graph for the genre representation, we see that that's actually, comedy was one of the surprising genres that we found to actually be able to travel, which is contrary to the literature in transnationalization, where comedy is thought to be a very culturally specific genre, which doesn't travel that well and is not really appealing to the foreign audiences. And Netflix managed to prove us otherwise. But in terms of comedy, we can see that the comedies are kind of a hybrid type of comedy, which includes drama comedy or romantic comedy. And finally, we see that Netflix is extending their physical presence in European markets by setting up offices and houses. So that means that they are here to stay and they really want to be thought of as a key producer of European content. And future research into these types of investments would deepen our understanding of the net model, and it would also benefit producers to understand the streaming wars and what rights they are giving away when they create these types of deals with Netflix. That is the end of my presentation. The article will be released this summer. I welcome you to read it, where it will be in detail and you will understand better this whole presentation. And that's it. If you have any questions, please address them to me. And I also invite my co-authors, Professor Ratz and Catalina Yudaki.
Thank you, Anaida. And also thank you, Tim, for your presentations. We already got some comments in the chats. And Tim already answered one of the questions of Maria Michalis. Nice to have you here, Maria. But let's maybe go to the other question of Hanne Bruun. Also welcome, Hanne. I know that your questions, it's for Tim. Do you have any data on narrowing diversity in terms of genre and audience choices of content in Flanders? So Tim, this is a question for you.
Thanks, Anna. It depends a bit on what you're looking for. I think Catalina has the best insight in what is available from audiences and genre. The difficulty with genre, and we've noticed it with the study that is also going to be presented later today, as well as the Netflix original study, is the difficulties of comparing catalogs, because we noticed that indeed Amazon, Disney, as well as the local players, they all categorize genre differently, and that makes it very tricky to compare. So it makes actual consistent, systematic comparison very difficult from an academic point of view. Actual figures on consumption of different genres, I don't know if we have them in Belgium, but I'm looking at Catalina now. I'm not sure.
I don't really have data on consumption. It's true, it's mostly on availability. And yeah, like you said, I'm going to go a bit further into that later, that it really is a question of labeling. And also we see the different labeling between SVOD and broadcasting VOD platforms, but also, yeah, a bit of a narrowing of diversity, maybe also when we talk about certain labeling of documentary that actually also includes a lot of reality formats, and also the different micro labeling and micro genres that certain platforms work with. But yeah, maybe I'm going to go a bit further into that during the presentation.
Thank you for your answers. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to take one more question from the chat. It's also a question for Tim from Lien Lesage from DPG Media. And she's wondering, within the European market, Viaplay is the only European player who is recently breaking out of its local market. So which limits of a smaller market Viaplay tackled to be able to go international? So maybe you can tell something about it, Tim.
Thanks for the question, Lynn. I think, in my humble opinion, because the Scandinavian market is not really my specialty, but I see that Jakob Nielsen and other Nordic colleagues are present. So feel free to answer if you have an idea on why this is. But I think it also has to do with the fact that to some extent there is more cultural proximity between the different Nordic markets, which also allows media players in the Nordic countries to base their operations in multiple markets. This is the case for the big news publishers, but also for broadcasters and for players like Viasat that have been active in more markets than only Denmark. And by investing in original content that is also likely to appeal other audiences than just Danish audiences, I think you create advantages of scale much more easily than in other markets. This is something that we don't, this goes against, for example, what we have with the Netherlands. We share the same language with Netherlands. There's obviously lots of huge cultural proximity, yet we don't watch each other's television shows, and if there is a film title successful, we rather remake it in Flanders and the other way around, rather than watch a Dutch film in Flemish cinemas. So that also means that creating scale is more difficult. If there would be more cultural proximity, I think an SVOD initiative that is a collaborative initiative with the Netherlands would be by far more sustainable, I would say. But if there are any Nordic colleagues who want to intervene on this, feel free.
Maybe I see in the chat that Jakob Nielsen is telling that, Tim, I believe your response is spot on with regards to Viaplay. So thank you for that response, Jakob. I propose we're going to the next presentation because we don't have a lot of time for more questions. But of course, after the next presentation, we can still go on with the discussion. So I will quickly introduce you to Professor Dr. Marleen Komorowski, who's also a researcher at imec-SMIT and VUB. And also working as an impact analyst at Cardiff University. And she prepared a presentation together with Ivana Kostovska, who is also doing a PhD at VUB and is a media economics and management researcher. So I'm waiting to see the presentation so you can start.
Yes, hello everyone. Just give me a second to get this up.
Yes, I can see your presentation. It's already on the second. Yeah, voilà. Perfect.
Yeah, here we are. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Marleen Komorowski and I was in the lead of this research study. The title, 2021 Update on the Transposition of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive regarding financial investment obligations to contribute to European work. This report was a collaborative research project of 5 of our colleagues here at SMIT, and I'm going to present this with my colleague Ivana. So we did publish in 2018 already a report on the same topic. We have actually seen great interest in this study from both the academic and academic community and policymakers. So because a lot has changed since 2018, we decided to update the research and give you the new findings of what is going on in terms of legislation for financial obligations for VOD players today. The report is already published on our website, and I'm happy to post it in the chat after the presentation for you. So first, a little bit of background. VOD providers and services are on the rise in Europe, as already Tim mentioned. The graph was also already shared earlier. At the same time, European VOD markets are increasingly dominated by US-based companies which accumulate large market shares in Europe, like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and Disney+. But still, European broadcasters, both public and private, take up most of the investment opportunities in original content. So this combination with increasing struggle for a lot of local broadcasters to capture revenue, many scholars and policymakers see investment into European content under scrutiny. The Audiovisual Media Service Directive, which was updated in 2018, actually opens up new possibilities and opportunities for member states to take VOD providers more into responsibility to secure a flourishing audiovisual market in Europe through investment obligations. So what does the Audiovisual Media Service Directive say? In Article 13, it stipulates that member states ensure that VOD services support European works. And on the one hand, this is done by the obligatory quota in the catalog of VOD services with a share of 30%. Actually, this has been implemented by most member states already. But Article 13 of the new Audiovisual Media Service Directive also stipulates that member states may require the providers of VOD services under their jurisdiction to contribute financially to the production of European work. And we have focused specifically on these financial obligations, not on the quota in the study, because there is very high fragmentation in Europe if it comes to this. So how can this be done based on the Audiovisual Media Service Directive? It can be achieved through either direct investment obligations in content or by the payment of a contribution to national funds like a film fund in Europe. Moreover, member states may also oblige providers who target audiences in their territories but are established in another European member state to do the same financial contributions. So that actually means that the Audiovisual Media Service Directive really aimed at creating a more level playing field, as a lot of public and private broadcasters in EU countries are already obliged to do such investments, either directly or to film funds. And therefore also now a lot of countries have started, or already before the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, to take players like Netflix and Amazon Prime more into responsibility in creating European audiovisual content. So while different member states already had similar measures in place, like France or Germany, a lot of countries have, since the publication of the new Audiovisual Media Service Directive, introduced new legislation to follow that guideline on how to create obligations for more European content. But there is really high fragmentation. So especially if it comes to what kind of financial obligations are being imposed on VOD providers, how they are calculated, and what the different exemptions are that have been put into regulation. So in order to find out what is actually the deal at the moment in all of these different European countries, we conducted since February to May a study focusing on the European member states' applicable laws. So we investigated in all of the member states the regulations, but we also consulted experts to help us really finding out what the legislation tells us in each of the member states. And I would like to thank all the experts who took the time to give us feedback and that we have implemented into the report at this point. So if some of you have joined here, thank you very much. So the report focuses on the following questions: where can the basic provisions for investment obligations be found? What are the criteria to determine which VOD providers are subject to the obligation? How are the investment obligations calculated? And finally, we also focused on what procedures do VOD providers need to follow in these based on these legislations. So just to give you a short update on what we found, there are now 12 member states or regions in the EU27 who impose financial obligations to promote European work on the providers of VOD services. 7 of these also capture foreign VOD providers. 4 member states have amended regulations since 2018. And further 5 are currently having draft laws in legislative procedure. So just based on this, you can see how much has changed in just a couple of years and how much more will change in the next couple of years and months in EU legislation if it comes to financial obligations for VOD providers. And we are happy that we have an update now, and maybe look forward to update again after a couple of years when more has changed again. And what kind of investment obligations exist? First, we have countries who have a levy in place that is being paid to a local film fund by VOD providers. This includes, as you can see on the map, Germany, Poland, and Croatia and Austria. Germany and Poland also capture foreign VOD providers on the levy. Then we have obligations to invest directly into European works, which happen through direct rights purchases or through co-productions or productions into local work. This includes countries like Italy, Spain, and Slovenia. And then we have a choice that either a levy or a tax is being paid or direct investment is being made. This is legislation which has been currently introduced in both the French and Flemish communities in Belgium. And then finally, we have countries that impose both a levy or a tax or a direct investment obligation. And this includes currently France, the Czech Republic, and Portugal. All of these laws, it sounds like very easily grouped, but they are very different and very fragmented in how they are implemented. So, for example, member states calculate the financial obligations based on sometimes variable percentages, lump sums or amount per subscriber. We have found that this can range from 0.5% of turnover of sales, which is the amount has been paid, that it has to be paid in Portugal, to up to 26%, with France really taking the lead. And France also is updating its law, so some of the percentages are going to change in July again. If there is not a percentage of the sales or some or revenue of the VOD providers, there can be something like a lump sum or an amount per subscriber often be chosen by a VOD provider to also be paid. And finally, I would like to highlight that these percentages are also very variable, because a lot of countries have in place that the bigger the VOD provider is, the more percentage they have to pay into European content, or it can depend on what kind of content the VOD provider provides. So for example, in France, the 26% is the case for pornographic VOD web services, or it can be the case that it depends on where the headquarters are located and so on. So it's very fragmented. And this also is being displayed via this short summary where we listed all of the 12 member states or regions in the EU, the different percentages. Also, the basis on which this is calculated is very different. So they take into consideration sometimes specific income, like only the income from films or only the income from subscribers. Some also take into consideration advertising income by VOD providers and so on. So this is just an overview, and you will find all of the detailed information in the actual report. And to exemplify the fragmentation, my colleague Ivana is now going to present some chosen case studies for you, Ivana.
Okay. So we will start by looking at the case study on Flanders. Here, there are two types of regulations that include obligations for VOD services, but each of these regulations applies to different type of players. So first, the incentives scheme deals with VODs as service distributors, and it covers VOD services that also distribute television signals. So how is the investment obligation defined here? So VOD players can make either a choice between making a direct investment obligation in, direct investment in co-production of audiovisual works, and that amounts at around 3 million euros per year, or invest a lump sum, this is the lump sum, or make a contribution per subscriber paid to the Flemish audiovisual fund. And actually VOD providers who are established in other EU member states and who are targeting the Flemish market are not captured by this investment obligation. And then the contribution scheme, which is the second one, was introduced in 2019. So before the revised AVMSD was transposed in Flanders. And the Minister of Media and Department of Culture, Youth and Media already announced that, that there could be a review of the current investment obligation. So VOD services established in other countries, such as Disney Plus or Netflix, are captured here by this investment obligation. So VOD services, again, have a right to choose either to make a financial contribution to production or co-production of Flemish audiovisual works, or to make a equivalent financial contribution to the Flemish audiovisual fund. And according to this contribution scheme, non-linear broadcasters must contribute 2% of their annual revenue based on the previous year. And the first project to receive financing from Netflix since the law was passed is Voices of Liberation. This is a docu-series about the Second World War, and the photo that you can see on the background is actually from the set. So does it mean that every niche player which offered targeted specific and target specific smaller audiences is captured by the investments obligation that exists in different countries? Actually, not all VOD players are captured. In the case studies that we analyze, we explain the rules on the scope of application, the definition and calculation methods, and all the applicable procedures. In Flanders, for example, non-linear television broadcasters with annual revenues of less than 500,000 euros are exempt from the investment obligation. But I will not go over the rules and in detail here, but you can read, of course, more about this in the report. We can go to the next slide. Now let's move on to France, which was the first country in Europe to introduce an investment obligation for VOD providers in 2009. And back then, the film levy was extended to capture the sale and rental of films online. VOD providers in France are actually subject to both direct investment obligation and levy payable to the film fund. So you can already see that it's quite different compared to Flanders. So how is the direct investment obligation defined? SVOD and TVOD must contribute between 15% and 26% of their annual turnover in previous year to European audiovisual and cinematographic production, and there is a share to French production. And catch-up services also must contribute to cinematographic works at the same rate. In December 2020, France already announced that it's planning to increase the rate of its direct investment obligation for VOD services between 20% and 25%, meaning that if this happens, then France could become the member state with the highest contribution. The video and the VOD tax was changed in 2018 to include foreign companies such as Netflix and YouTube to pay a levy to the CNC. And the rate for VOD services is set at 5.15%, but could rise to 15%, as already mentioned by my colleague Marlene. This is in net annual turnover for certain income. And here also it's important to mention that the rate already was increased from 2 to 5.15%, and this in 2020. And this illustrates how actually countries such as France are always on the lookout for a way to level the playing field between the traditional and new players. We can go to the next slide. So moving on now to Poland, where the investment obligation is in a form of levy. So, and the levy was introduced as part of an anti-crisis relief program. And it consists of 1.5% of the revenue obtained from fees for access for VOD services available to the public, or revenue obtained from broadcaster commercial communication if this revenue in a certain period is higher. The government estimates that the levy could generate around 4.5 million euros annual revenue, and in the first 6 months after introduction is already a bit below the original estimation made by the government. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's move on to looking at some interesting cases of small countries that plan to introduce investment obligations for providers established in other EU member states. I will talk about Slovenia and Croatia as examples, but in the study we identify more cases where investment obligations are either introduced or changed. So Croatia plans to introduce a levy for VOD providers established in other EU member states. And in the legislative process, the Croatian Audiovisual Center, which is the national funding agency, proposed the investment obligation to be in a form of choice between direct investment obligation and a levy of 10% of revenue generated in Croatia. And there are two interesting aspects to mention here. The first interesting aspect about the Croatian case is that the film agency is using France as an example, but not to mimic the French model, but to argue that the investment obligation that they propose is more flexible and moderate compared to the one in France. And the second interesting aspect is that the Croatian policymakers actually try to build a strategy on how the domestic audiovisual markets could benefit from the global VOD players' obligation to invest in European content. So they perceive that Netflix and also other VOD players will have to invest in production capacities in Europe to meet the AVMSD rules for investment in European content. And in this context, Croatia is considering to open a film studio complex to attract international productions by global streamers that expand spending for original content and use local creative talent. Slovenia plans to introduce a levy of 2% to VOD providers that will be collected in a new European audiovisual production fund. And the fund will be managed by the Ministry for Media, and it will also accumulate levies from different type of players. And as Slovenia is very small audiovisual markets, the estimates for the collected amounts are very modest. We can go quickly to the last slide. So we also took a look to the motivations for introducing investment obligations, which are put forward by policymakers in the countries that we analyzed. And of course, the overall motivation for introducing investment obligations for VOD providers is creating a level playing field. But, and this was the imperative for updating the AVMSD rules for VOD providers. But also we identified other motivations listed in the laws and other documents, which we categorize as economic, cultural, and linked to improving the industry competitiveness. So I will stop here so my colleague Marlene could continue with elaborating the final thoughts and recommendations.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Just very quickly, because we went also a little bit over time here, what I would like you as the audience to take out of this presentation is that we have found that there is an increasing consensus within the EU and the different countries that companies that benefit from content should also contribute to content production. So creating a level playing field between TV broadcasters and VOD services. And especially that more and more big international VOD players like Netflix and Amazon Primes are being obliged to take up more responsibility in this regard. So what do we expect to happen in the next coming months and years? We expect that other EU member states will follow suit in introducing investment obligations, and also that the ones which already have might adapt their legislation further. There is high fragmentation across legislation, as you could have seen by all the examples Ivana presented and my slides. But what we recommend actually is that policymakers build future legislation on existing legislation and practices to ensure more legal predictability for companies in the EU. This does not mean to just copy paste one country's law to your own, but that we also advise to take into account the path-dependent and cultural, contextual situation in each of the countries, which has led to the legislation as it is today, and will also help to find the best way to create legislation in the future. So thank you very much. This is the list of all of the colleagues who have contributed. So thank you also Catalina, Stephanie, and Tim for contributing. Here's the link, but I'm also going to post it in the chat to the full study. And yeah, we are happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Marlene and Ivana. So yes, we're already a bit over time, but I propose we do take one question from Ellie Vervloed from VRT. She's asking, do you also see a negative impact of imposing quota and investment obligations, increasing war on talent for local broadcasters and platforms? So maybe you can answer this question.
So far, and as you have seen in the presentation, all of these investment obligations are fairly new. There was a court case against the German situation of the levy from Netflix, where they were arguing that the levy that has to be paid by Netflix to the German Film Fund is not suitable, but the court actually did some analysis and they found it suitable and fair. But I think we will see in the coming years really what the negative impacts really are. I can imagine that VOD players to be established in certain countries find it very difficult to figure out the different laws. That's why we are recommending a little bit more harmonization. And this is really, it's really a complicated issue if you look at the different regulations. So we don't have any data on it. You could expect some negative impact possibly. I don't say that's not, it's all good that they all introduce more investment obligations, but I hope we can maybe do a study within the next couple of years to really see the impact of these investment obligations in all of the countries.
Okay, thank you, Marlene. Tim also shared the link to the updated report, so you can find the whole report via the link. I propose we take a 10-minute break and we start again at 11, and then Stefanie Tintel will tell us some more about what cinema future might look like. So thank you for your attention and see you in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Activities, such as cinema going for an unprecedented time. This graph that Tim also showed in the introduction shows another interesting fact. In 2019, European box office and the SVOD revenue were about equal in size. However, in 2020, the European box office dropped by approximately 71%, and the SVOD market grew by approximately 40% compared to 2019. So I think it's safe to say that the SVOD revenue model has been the main driver of the entertainment industry in the pandemic. Traditionally, the exclusive theatrical window is the primary window for a film. it's collecting most of its revenue then. The film is then exclusively collecting revenue in cinemas. But then during the pandemic, when cinemas were closed, movie studios started to experiment with this window and film distribution altogether. So in short, we have seen the following shifts happen. Firstly, the length of the exclusive theatrical window shrank from a 90 days window to a 45 days window. And secondly,
Oh, Stephanie, we can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, I'll start again. Sorry. So No Time to Die. Will you watch it in the cinema or will you watch it via streaming? So I'll present the results about the analysis I did on the cinema going motivations and stream viewing behavior of young Flemish audiences in times of COVID. So COVID-19 has severely limited socio-cultural activities such as cinema going for an unprecedented time. This graph that Tim also showed in the introduction shows another interesting fact. In 2019, European box office and the SVOD revenue were about equal in size. However, in 2020, the European box office dropped by approximately 71% and the SVOD market grew by approximately 40%. I think it's safe to say that the SVOD revenue model has been the main driver of the entertainment industry during the pandemic. Traditionally, the exclusive theatrical window is a primary window for a film, collecting most of its revenue. The film is then exclusively collecting revenue in cinemas. However, during the pandemic, when cinemas were closed, movie studios started to experiment with this window and film distribution altogether. So in short, we have seen the two following shifts happen. Firstly, the length of the exclusive theatrical window shrank from a 75 to 90 days window, from a 75 90 days window to a 45 days window. And secondly, the exclusivity of the theatrical window is also not always protected anymore, as titles are now being released simultaneously in movie theaters and on demand, also called a day and date release. For example, the new Disney film Cruella now, which is available in cinemas and will be soon here in cinemas when they reopen, is also available on premium video on demand on Disney+, meaning you will have to pay a surcharge on top of your already current subscription on Disney+ to be able to watch it. So film distribution has become some sort of a case-by-case strategy to determine what is best or what is most beneficial for the movie, the studio, or the producer, exhibitors, and consumers. So what about this last group? So what about the consumer? What about our young Flemish consumers? Are they going to watch Cruella in the cinemas next week when they reopen on June 9? Or are they watching Cruella on Disney+ and paying a subcharge of 21.99 euros? Okay, this brings us to the objective of my study. As with COVID, we've seen a battle between home video and movie theaters really taking off. And with cinema closed for the greater part of the past 15 months, I'm sure we're all wondering what this has done to the audience's interest and to what extent they're looking forward to returning to cinemas. Hence, the objective of the study is to identify current attitudes, preferences, and influencing factors regarding cinema going and stream viewing of young Flemish audiences. To meet the objective, we have collected data via an online survey which was distributed in March 2021. At that time, all sociocultural activities were limited except for the museums. So the sample includes young Flemish audiences, being people living in the Flemish community of Belgium, dus het Vlaamse gewest, and are aged between 20 and 34 years of age. The sample is representative for the population young Flemish audiences, let's say, in terms of gender, male, female, and age groups, which you can see in the table on the slide. Overall, we have a sample that is well educated, living with friends and family, but doesn't have children and is employed. And I will now present the 5 key lessons of my study. So we asked the respondents to indicate the 3 sociocultural activities that they missed most. And cinemas appeared to be the 3rd most missed activity. However, when we asked to indicate how eager they are to return to cinemas, they appear to be a bit hesitant. Only 4 in 10 indicated they're rather hesitant to return immediately, However, 2 in 10 seem to be very eager to return, and we might see this group within the first 2 weeks of cinema reopenings. Pay attention that when I say audiences, it's people aged between 20 and 34 years of age, so a rather young group. Additionally, 7 in 10 estimate going to the cinemas with the same cinema frequency attendance as before COVID. So while audiences miss cinema going, they appear a bit hesitant to return immediately, but overall they expect to go back with the same attendance frequency as before COVID. A second key lesson is that audiences highly value safety, comfort, and accessibility. The respondents had to indicate to what extent they found the contextual factors in the table important or unimportant. It appears that clean and comfortable seats was valued the highest, meaning audiences care a lot about the hygiene and the comfort. The price of the cinema ticket is valued second highest, and then factors related to infrastructure of the cinema complex complete the top 5 most valued factors of cinema going, being the sound in the movie theater, a good and easy accessibility of the cinema complex, and that the seat occupation in the movie theater is well organized. Interestingly, the film offer and factors related to the social practice of cinema going are valued to a lesser extent than we originally expected, as they are not present in the top 5 most valued factors. This might indicate a potential shift in the importance of some contextual factors regarding cinema going. A third key lesson is that audiences are more eager to watch blockbusters than Flemish films in cinemas upon reopening. We asked the audiences to indicate which films they would like to see or watch in the cinema upon reopening. On average, 4 in 10 are interested in watching international blockbusters, very big international blockbusters, such as No Time to Die. And on average, 2 in 10 show an interest in watching Flemish films in cinemas upon reopening. And of these 6 Flemish films that we presented, Ritueel appeared, Doobie or Ritual appeared to be the most popular film of the Flemish titles. Just to balance this out of a list of 21 titles, Ritueel was ranked the 3rd most popular. So I think we can say that it's either going to be an international blockbuster or a Flemish film. But all the other films in between, we saw rather low interest for them. So when audiences have to choose, chances are 2 times higher, we can say maybe, that they will pick a big international blockbuster than a Flemish film. Additionally, when cinemas will be open, there will be a large offer of films, as many films are waiting to be released. For example, now in France, the film offer is 2 to 3 times larger than before COVID. And also films will be scheduled for a shorter time than in cinema, as I explained in the beginning. So these facts make us a bit worried about the visibility of Flemish film and consequently also about the upcoming cinema attendance for Flemish films. As such, we really want to emphasize the importance for the promotion of Flemish films. A 4th key lesson is that the price can make a difference between choosing to watch a film in the cinema and watching it via streaming. But firstly, we have seen that there is a positive correlation between cinema attendance frequency and future cinema going. So there is a positive correlation between your cinema attendance frequency and future intentions of going and the streaming of films on streaming services, meaning that the more you went to the cinema or the more you intend to go to the cinema, the more you are streaming films on a streaming service. Important, this correlation is not present with regards to series streaming. So that's as a first, but then we have seen that price might be influencing this relationship between cinema going and streaming of films. We've seen this because of the following situation. We presented the respondents with 3 trade-off questions with the following situation. So imagine No Time to Die is released in cinemas and on a streaming service you are currently subscribed to. So it's going to be a day and date release, potentially. So if there is no difference between watching it in the cinema, if there is no price difference between watching it in a cinema and via streaming, 4 in 10 prefer to go watch it in a cinema, whereas 2 in 10 prefer to watch it via a streaming service. If the streaming service offers a better price than watching it in the cinema and it's still released at the same time, then only 1 in 10 prefer to watch it in the cinema, but 6 in 10 prefer to watch it via streaming. And whether they have to wait 3 weeks for the release via streaming, but it's still cheaper than cinema, they then still 1 in 10 prefer to watch it in the cinema, whereas 6 in 10 prefer streaming, meaning we are dealing with a very patient audience. Hence, when the cinema price becomes more expensive than the streaming options, audiences are 4 times less likely to watch it in the cinema. However, we think that this must be balanced out a bit and compared to the previous correlation we found. So we think that price could be moderating the relationship between cinema going and film streaming as they appear to be positively correlated. And then a final conclusion is that we can conclude that audiences clearly found their way to Flemish VODs. Netflix appears to be the most popular for watching films and series, followed by VRT Nu and VTM Go. VRT Nu and VTM Go appear to be watched by almost half of the population and are almost equally popular. Then we see that Disney Plus is just a little bit more popular than streams, as 1 in 4 indicate watching Disney Plus, and let's say 2 in 10 indicate watching streams. But when we ask the respondents for which streaming services you are considering to subscribe to in the future, 2 in 10 indicate streams, whereas only 1 in 10 indicate Disney Plus. And also 1 in 10 indicates considering to subscribe to Netflix. So this makes us conclude that the SVOD market in Flanders is, I think, not yet saturated, as we still see some considerations in the audiences, and in which we definitely also see a potential for Flemish streaming services. We also see that on average, young audiences are subscribed to 1.5 SVOD services, but watch films and series on a total of 2.8 streaming services. So almost half of the services that they watch are either free or illegal services. And also the large majority, so 8 in 10 people, are not willing to pay more than 19 euros per month for all the SVOD subscriptions they have together. So hence audiences pay on average 19 euros for their 1.5 SVOD services on average. Now I will come to the conclusion, or I will present 5 recommendations based on the key lessons that I've just presented. Firstly, we recommend to clearly communicate about safety measurements, as young audiences seem to highly value hygiene and comfort. Secondly, we recommend to make the cinema complex as accessible as possible, as audiences highly value sound accessibility of the complex and a good seat organization more than the film offer and the social practice of cinema going, apparently. Thirdly, we recommend to potentially consider increasing the promotion for Flemish film, as there will be many films released. The theatrical window is shortened and young audiences are more inclined to watch a blockbuster than a Flemish film. And fourthly, we recommend to attract young audiences to cinemas with interesting price deals, as they are very sensitive to the price. And finally, we recommend to consider maybe collaboration between streaming services and cinemas or local exhibitors, as we have found a significant positive relationship between cinema going and the streamed viewing of films. And that is it. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can address me here or via email. I would also like to thank Tim Raats for all his help, and more information you can find in the policy brief that was distributed this morning in an article of the Standaards. However, these publications are written in Dutch, and an article, an English one, is upcoming in the Scientific Journal Participations. And that was it. And while I may respond to your questions, I have prepared a poll because I'm actually very curious what your interest would be when you're going back to the cinema. So you can copy the link. I'm not sure if it's working. I think I can copy Eileen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, I don't know if you can copy. I'm not in your computer. But yeah, if you want to participate in this little poll, in the meantime, we can already answer some questions from the audience. Oscar Alvarado has a question for you. So you did mention the influence of price, but what about other variables, such as the technical installation, better audio in the cinema versus home? Which is the preference regarding these other variables?
Yeah, so I think we then have to go back to the table I presented of the influencing factors of cinema going. I think for now, but I have to say this might have been a social desirable answer, as really all of the factors related to comfort, hygiene were top ranked or ranked in the top 5. I didn't specifically ask about technical installations, but I did ask a question: how interested are you in watching a premium format? And then I saw that IMAX was actually really popular. 4 in 10 indicated that they are interested in watching an IMAX film, compared to 8 in 10 that set a standard 2D film. But all the other premium formats had a rather low interest, saying 1 to 10 or 2 to 10 that are interested in 3D. So IMAX really pops out there. I think also the sound in the cinema movie theater is one of the most important things that might influence them.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And I have another question from Christine Eloi, I guess. She says, yeah, very interesting. Would you also have more extended data on audiences, content, for example, non-national European films to echo the AVMS quotas? Or if the question is not very clear, I can ask Christine to maybe elaborate on the question. Maybe Christine, you can...
Yeah, I think this is regarding the quota. I didn't specifically look at this. I just looked at the interest of the audience here. Wait, can I read the question maybe?
I can help on that.
Thank you.
The question is that when you give the data now, it was essentially on Flemish and American movies. So my question is, what about the others? You have also data. You have put Druk in your little poll now. So what are the information on the other films? And also the audience here is limited to a certain range of the audience. So if you look more globally what it gives, I mean, it's very interesting to have a global view. Voila.
I cannot, I can only speak for the population that I've researched now, being the young Flemish audiences until between the ages of 20 and 34. And I've presented a list with 21 films, of which I try to be representative, let's say, in terms of all the different genres that are there, and of films that have been a bit in promotion already, just to see where the difference in genre lies between the interests. So I didn't specifically do an analysis on the differences between the European films that will be screened or the US films, but I see mainly the interest goes to big international blockbusters such as No Time to Die and The King's Man were the top 2 most popular ones, and then follow actually the Flemish films. But this is a bit of a lower interest. And then all the other films I presented were, for example, Nomadland or Drunk, or a thriller, Quiet Place Part 2. But all of these interests were like maybe 1 in 10. So maybe they're not familiar yet with the offer. So that's all I can say.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. We're gonna wrap up here for this presentation. Maybe Stephanie, you want to say something about the results of the poll?
Yes, and to my surprise, so 3 out of 10, so 31% indicates I'm not interested in any of these films. Also not a Flemish film after my whole presentation. Okay, so I see Druk. Yeah, Another Round is the most popular one. So maybe we are dealing with an audience here from Scandinavia, maybe. Okay, very interesting. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Stefanie. Yeah, Tim already remarked that there are a lot of Danish or Swedish colleagues here who are attending. There is another question in the chat, but maybe, Stefanie, you can also answer that in the chat. So everybody has an answer on this question. Then I invite Axel Asmar to share your presentation. Axel Asmar is also a PhD researcher here at VUB and also a part of imec-SMIT. And she will tell us some more about branding diversity on the corporate and cultural strategy at the heart of Netflix global expansion. So I'll tell you, Axel, when your presentation is visible. Yes, I see your presentation clearly. Thank you, Axel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Eline, for the introduction. So I will be looking today at the branding strategy of Netflix and particularly at Netflix's focus on diversity. Since 2018, Netflix has been more and more vocal about its commitment to diversity. In February 2021, they commissioned the first report on diversity, looking at on-screen and off-screen talent across all the Netflix original released between 2018 and 2019. And the result of the study showed that Netflix overall has a more diverse makeup on and off screen than most, if not all, the Hollywood studio. But importantly for the presentation, in this report, Netflix expresses the goal of being the benchmark of an industry, which is, according to Netflix, sometimes very slow to change. So this presentation looks at the how, but also the why Netflix is more and more vocal about its commitment to diversity. And so the main argument of the presentation is that as Netflix expands outside of the Anglo-Saxon world, the diversity strategy adopted by Netflix is key to its expansion, because on the one side, it allows Netflix to strengthen its foothold in more established markets. But on the other side, it allows Netflix to gain visibility in newer markets. So at the practical level, understanding how Netflix frames itself may help us actually contextualize Netflix's strategy in specific markets. At an academic level, looking then at how Netflix promotes itself might also help us understand the cultural power of a platform such as Netflix. What is important to keep in mind is that this research does not try to assess whether or not the diversity strategy laid out by Netflix is genuine or simply performative. But the aim is really to understand, one, how Netflix promotes itself, but also what this branding strategy can tell us about their market strategy in our respective countries. So to understand what Netflix means when talking about diversity, we analyzed press releases and shareholders' letters published publicly on the Netflix website. In addition then to those press releases and shareholders' letters, we also analyzed the coverage of Netflix in European and international magazines, such as The Guardian, or Variety, or Deadline, and so forth. And so the data collection spans from December 2019 until May 2021 for a total of 800 plus documents. So what does Netflix mean when talking about diversity? So the word cloud that you can see on the screen displays the 200 most common terms that Netflix associate with diversity. And so as you can see, the emphasis spans several aspects, such as racial and ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity or sexual diversity. So the question then becomes, looking at all these aspects, how then does Netflix translate these aspects across different countries and cultures? And so the finding shows that the way Netflix operationalized these different aspects of its diversity strategy differ in function of its level of penetration in a specific market. And so we see a difference between established and emerging market in Netflix's strategy. The established markets are the country where Netflix has been present since at least 2013. So these are countries such as the United States, but also Brazil or France or Spain. And so in this market, the diversity strategy is really used to strengthen Netflix foothold. As this market are characterized on the one hand by the massive arrival of national but also global competitors, and on the other hand by the pushback of national or regional policies that are trying to contain the reach of Netflix. Emerging markets, on the other side, refer then to the latest country where Netflix has been expanding since 2016. So these are countries such as India, but also South Africa or Thailand. And so these emerging markets are characterized by a very young population, but with a strong media consumption. What is also interesting in those emerging markets is that they are culturally very different from the traditional offer of Netflix programming. So in these markets, the strategy is mainly focused on attracting visibility and attracting subscribers. So to understand then how this diversity strategy of Netflix is translated across this market, we propose then what we call a diversity matrix to give a visual overview of this strategy. So for each of these markets, emerging and established, we have looked at, on the one hand, how Netflix deploys its diversity strategy in its relation with creators. That is how, that is producers, production companies, writers, and filmmakers. So what we have in gray under production. And on the other hand, we have looked at how the diversity strategy is translated in its relation with its audience. So what we have under audience in red. And what we see is that in established markets, the diversity strategy is used on the one hand to differentiate Netflix from its main competitor. And on the other hand, in established market, it is really used to attract a younger audience. In emerging market, on the other side, the diversity narrative is used to, at the level of production, to acquire local talent and local content. But at the level of audience, it is really used to attract a new type of audience. And so in the following slides, we then look at the diversity matrix more in detail. So as I said, in established market at the level of production, we see that Netflix uses this diversity strategy as a strategy of differentiation. That is to say, as a strategy to highlight meaningful difference between Netflix and its competitors. So in these most established markets, such as France or the United States, diversity in film and television industry has always been a point of contention, and in this recent year more than ever. And so by highlighting its commitment to diversity, Netflix promotes itself in this established market as a game changer in an industry that is either too slow or too unwilling to change. And so this image of Netflix as a game changer, but more importantly, as an ally for change, affect positively its relations with creatives, especially those who have the feeling, such as in France, that producers and TV channels are missing the boat by denying the change that younger consumers have been asking and have been pushing for. On the other side, in emerging markets at the level of production, Netflix uses its diversity strategy as a way to indigenize itself. So as a way to insert itself in local and national markets. And so in this emerging market, Netflix presents itself at the same time as a matchmaker, so introducing local talent to the world. But also Netflix advertises itself as a supporter of local production, thereby then trying to attract young creatives. But it should also be pointed out that this strategy of indigenization is also increasingly adopted in established markets, where then more and more Netflix is being asked to invest in local production. So this image of Netflix as a supporter of local production is becoming more and more prominent in their communication with established markets such as the United Kingdom, but also Belgium or Spain, for example. At the level of audience, when it comes to established markets, we see that Netflix uses its emphasis on diversity as a commitment to representation. So in this strategy, the main message of Netflix in established markets is that there is a story for everyone, and that each and everyone can and will see themselves represented on and off screen on Netflix. And this strategy of representation is usually targeted at younger audience and very much reinforced by the fact that Netflix is very often putting flagship shows such as Bridgerton, but also Sex Education to the fore. So shows that have been acclaimed by young audience for their diversity, but also for the topics that they are dealing with. In emerging markets, on the other side, the focus of the diversity strategy is about cosmopolitanism. The particularity of this market is a very young generation whose taste in film and television is very different from the older generation. So in their communication with audiences, Netflix uses then its commitment to diversity to promote a platform that is set on changing or disrupting traditional codes, either in terms of genres or in terms of storyline, for example. For example, more and more Netflix original in India, a country with a very conservative media policy, feature, for example, now explicit sex scenes or are explicitly political, such as the drama series Daily Crime, which is based on the real rape and murder of a 23-year-old student. But what this diversity matrix reveals is that this calibration of Netflix around concepts of diversity allows then Netflix to become a transnational broadcaster because it allows Netflix then to create a global brand by invoking experience and values of humanism, of inclusion, of equality that are shared mostly everywhere. But at the same time, it allows Netflix to address niche audience, and especially through its tagging system and its recommendation, which more and more include non-normative identities, such as categories such as gay and lesbian movies or the newly added Black Lives Matter. But moving beyond then established genres and convention and established categorizations, it raises then question not just about the findability of content, but also about the niche marketing that is linked to this tagging system. Which then brings me to the last point of the presentation, namely what potential consequences for our local industries, but also for our local audiences. At the level of production, Netflix's ambition is more and more to support and promote local content with a universalist claim that great stories that come from everywhere and that can be loved everywhere. But recent research from South Korea already showed that this growing indigenization of a platform such as Netflix is changing storytelling codes and practices, with local producers adapting more and more their content to the taste, but also the sensibilities of a global audience rather than a local audience. And this echoes also what South African filmmakers are saying, that the Netflix original may be locally produced, but they have much more in common with Riverdale or with Gossip Girl than with the local context. And at the level of audience, the question is really a societal one. So the discussions on diversity in film and television industry is very complex. So by putting, willingly or not, an emphasis on the shortcomings of national industry with the strategy of differentiation, for example, is Netflix alienating young audience further from national film and television industry? Such seems to be the case in France. How then does the Netflix strategy fit within or disrupt existing national debates about diversity in television and film industries? Are there lessons to be taken, or is Netflix really becoming the benchmark of our industries? And yeah, and that is all for me. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any question, just let me know.
Thank you, Axel, for your very critical presentation, which is very welcome these days. Catherine Johnson has a question for you about this concept of diversity. So what does Netflix mean by diversity, and how is it measured? When Netflix gave evidence to the DCMS Select Committee inquiry into the future of PSM in the UK, they were unable to provide figures about the diversity of their UK-based staff. To what extent is their diversity strategy representative of a genuine commitment to increasing diversity across all roles in the industry, off and on screen?
Yes. So how is it measured? Netflix hasn't actually shared the measurement of their diversity strategy. So they have worked for this report with the Annenberg University, which is already famous, at least in the United States, for its measurement of diversity in Hollywood studios. So according to their report, they have scored really high on all the indicators provided by or used by the study. And before then, this report, they had also published a report about the diversity at the level of the workforce, so the diversity within Netflix itself, within the workforce, the work floor of Netflix. So they don't release their metrics. They give the broad results, and they try really, especially now, to commit themselves in everything that they do to be this huge advocate of diversity. To what extent it is a representative of a genuine commitment to diversity, it's hard to say. But we see that they're investing more and more. For example, after this report was published, Netflix also announced that they were dedicating $100 million, I think, for this creative fund around equity. So basically, they have decided that they are only going to work with production houses or grassroots organizations that really show a commitment or a track record of diversity in their day-to-day activity. So measuring it or assessing the genuine nature of the commitment, it's hard to say, but through their action, we see that they're really trying to implement this diversity strategy, not just in the United States, but across all the markets in which they are present.
Thank you, Axel. We have another question from Josep Petro. You have several questions, Josep. He's also congratulating you with your very interesting presentation. And he's also wondering if you will have an article published on this. I'm sure when this is the case, we will inform you about this. But I'll pick one of the questions, because then we're gonna go to the next presentation. So what are the risks of branding diversity and producing contents associated with the diversity of identities?
what are the risks then at the local level, or what are the risks for Netflix? Could you
You can use your microphone, Josep, if that is easier to elaborate on your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, that was really interesting. Yes, just really quick. I mean the risks in general for society, cultural risks, perhaps in the sense you were talking about South Africa and the case of Queen Sono, but also in an industrial way. If that's a marketing strategy, then the balance between industrial interests and perhaps cultural interests.
Yeah. So at that level, then a potential risk would be that Netflix become, especially at the local level, the sole definer of what diversity means. Because even so, establishing their creative fund for equity, they clearly state that they are going to work now with, or they are going to try to work more and more with production companies, with creatives, with a track record of diversity. But then diversity being defined on Netflix's term. So this diversity strategy takes on very different aspects according to the different market and the sensibilities of each cultural or national markets. So one of the risks being that a point of negotiation between Netflix and the local producers, for example, would be Netflix having the upper hand in defining what is being diverse in a specific country. Or in a specific cultural market or linguistic market, for example. So that is already a potential risk. It could also increase competition, or at the level actually of the audience, with the main competitors of Netflix. So in Europe, that would be public service broadcasters. In the United States or in North America with big Hollywood studio. Because they emphasize their role as game changer, it could also give an added strain on the relationship between either local producers, but also local, regional, or national producers. So these are, for now, the risks that I can see.
Okay, thank you, Axel. I also see that Florian Van Lee has a question, and Josep, you have some other questions, and also Catherine Johnson has a follow-up question. So Axel, I invite you to answer them maybe in the chat, so everybody is satisfied. And then I propose that we go to the next presentation of Catalina Iordache. She's also a researcher at SMIT's imec, and also doing a PhD on international film flows in a digital era. And she's going to tell you some more about the streaming offerings in Flanders. I will tell you when your presentation is visible, Catalina.
Is it not?
No, it's not yet.
How about now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, thank you, Aline, for the introduction. And also thank you, colleagues, for already talking everyone through the general context. I'm not going to repeat it much more because it really is the same, right? So we've got a European market that we see is being dominated more and more by US SVOD platforms in terms of revenue, in terms of subscribers. What's interesting for us to really base our research on and look at in a small market like Flanders or Belgium, depending how we are conducting the research, is also to see how maybe local offerings are responding to this. And so we see this through the rise of BVOD, so broadcaster video on demand, which is really an interesting type of platform, really a hybrid between catch-up advertising VOD, but that also has increasingly elements of subscription VOD, right? So we see specific content made exclusively for online, the need for an account and a login, personalization used. And also, as Tim was mentioning earlier, SVOD alliances, really in order to compete with larger and more attractive offerings. The objectives of this particular presentation really to answer some questions about the offerings and the market in Flanders. So what is the size of each catalog? What type of content is on offer? How recent is the content offering? And what is the origin? We did this by collecting data on offerings during March 2021 in a number of collected ways. We web scraped different sources, also from third-party aggregators to get data on US platforms. This is to make the collection feasible because of the large number of titles, but also to access more complete catalog data and manual collection directly on the Flemish platforms. And it's always important to state that the results always need to be contextualized. So we mainly use them as a backdrop for available content offerings, but really as a first step in conducting more in-depth research, as you've seen so far, really connected to all of the different strands that we do, because of course it's important to see what's available if we then want to look at how this content is consumed, or the way in which it is promoted, looking at discoverability more, and also maybe in the future looking at quota, maybe potentially even impact of investment obligations. These are the 8 platforms that I will be presenting some data on. It was really choosing a combination of SVOD and BVOD in the Flemish market. Also interesting because what we've seen from previous research in the Flemish Digimeter, but also in my colleague Stephanie Tintel's survey, showing that Flemish audiences really do mix and match and usually go for a combination of an SVOD and BVOD. So already starting with some findings, these are the catalogs that we gained access to. And of course, there are great disparities, but also it's important to always keep in mind the different strategies between SVOD and BVOD. There's of course a faster rotation of offerings on BVOD as they make use of a lot of catch-up content rather than long-term availability, as in the case of SVOD. Some background noise.
Peter de Papa, can you turn off your mic, please? Thank you.
The joys of Zoom presentation. We're looking a bit closer at the type of content. Again, not too surprising. We see that, of course, SVOD really has catalogs fully made, more scripted and fiction-oriented. We also see the larger number of documentary films and docu-series on Netflix. And this is something that we know Netflix brands itself through, particularly crime docu-series. But again, also difficult to assess because it also labels a lot of its reality formats as documentary, while the labeling that we see on BVOD platforms is a lot clearer in this, also because they have a lot of other scripted content and non-scripted content. So even though we have the smaller catalogs for specifically the local BVOD platforms, but we do see more diversity in type of content, of course. And this slide goes a bit more into detail, where we really see BVOD offerings with other scripted content, where we really looked at short format and web series, or non-scripted content where we counted news, infotainment, current affairs, game shows. It's important to see that all of this is really content with very strong local character that really sets them apart from international offerings. So of course, this is where we see where the two complement each other, let's say. Also interesting to note that VRT New and VTM Go have also a lot of children's content on their platforms. I'm not going to go into detail here, but we are looking into that data. And this is captured mainly under the series typology here. Again, it was interesting to look at year of release. So how old is the content on the platforms? How new? In terms of absolute numbers, the majority of titles are rather recent. When we look at percentages, we really do see Disney Plus and Amazon making use of their back catalog titles for increased volume, while BVOD platforms have really largely recent content offerings. But again, that also goes back to their segments of non-scripted content, which is really, again, formed of news and quite recent, of course, up-to-date content. Looking specifically at Belgian productions that we found in the databases, we see Belgian productions on VRT New, really with recent titles. Sooner and Amazon Prime Video mixing old and new Belgian production titles, mostly film in this case. So then, because it's always interesting for us to look at origin, and this is something that I am particularly interested in my research, this was again not unexpected, but it is quite striking to see Disney has the least diverse offering. Over 90% of their content is US content. They have some additions from the UK and Canada. Netflix has the most diverse, internationally diverse, also content from India, South Korea, Japan. But again, we know that a lot of this is back catalog, so really bulking up volume. While for the Belgian platforms, they really are more European. We see a lot more content from France, the Netherlands, titles from Germany, even in the case of the SVOD platforms, such as Sooner. Again, comparing the volume of US and Belgian content, not that surprising. US platforms will have mostly US content, but Belgian platforms release significant amount of Belgian content. What is striking is that Disney Plus, well, what we found at least, was really only one Belgian production out of their over 1,000 titles. Amazon Prime and Netflix do have some Belgian productions. A lot of them are French-speaking minority productions, so France Wallonia productions. Streams is, of course, an interesting case here. They do have more US content, but they are, in a sense, the HBO proxy. They're a bit of a Trojan horse in the in our Belgian sample, and so we know that also it is mostly recent and high quality content, although it is the US content that they have. Zooming in a bit on the Netflix catalog, it was interesting to compare with some data that we had from research I conducted last year on their Belgian catalog. So compared to that, they have added 1,000 more titles in since April of last year. But this only includes 6 more Belgian productions. So in March 2021, we only found 71 Belgian productions on the platform, out of which only 27 were Belgian majority productions, so Belgium as first country of production. And this has implications for the content discoverability, as minority productions are usually not always labeled as Belgian content on the platform, and thus more difficult to find, for example, if you are searching for Belgian series or film. Some key takeaways. Again, it's important to keep in mind the different strategies between SVOD and BVOD. So although, of course, we see a lot more titles on SVOD, BVOD has a different strategy. And although their volumes, they seem small, they may be deceivingly so, because they also have a lot of catch-up content that is rotated over short time periods. We do see primarily scripted content on SVOD, of course. The documentary used by Netflix as a staple, but again, also extending into reality formats, which we know are cheaper to produce. So we can assume that may also be one of the reasons. And then also BVOD with more short format, web series, and non-scripted content with very strong local character. For SVOD, more internationally diverse, so really also non-European titles, very limited Belgian content, while we do see BVOD offering more European titles, but also mostly Western European. From a research point of view, it's essential to highlight the methodological challenges of conducting this type of study. First, due to the difficulties in actually accessing complete and accurate data on offerings. So even on the platforms themselves, sometimes it is very difficult to access a full list of titles or to find them labeled correctly. And it's also difficult to analyze the titles due to inconsistent labeling because certain type of content, genre, origin are done differently on the different platforms. And in terms of conducting a comparative research, there is usually a need then for the completion of this data from other sources. So for example, we would make use of IMDb to really try to streamline a bit the typology and the genre. But again, this is a very cumbersome process that is also, it can lead to a lot of mistakes in the final, in the final result. So directions for future research, really, it would be interesting to then, like I said, take this first step and really go forward into looking at more in-depth comparisons of the premium and exclusive offerings that we know platforms are really competing through at this point. The type of content, again, it's important to really go deeper into this. How much of these series are reality TV, or how much of these documentaries are reality TV? How much of the series are children's content? Also in terms of genre, of course, it's important for really different perspectives, country of origin again, and also discoverability and prominence of content. The ways in which platforms really make use of their algorithm and their interface, their device versatility, but also the way audiences make use of the offerings in their choices and the consumption context. Recommendations for future research on this, and hopefully maybe future collaborations with some of you, it would really be to also force collaborations with the platforms themselves for increasing accuracy and also understanding a bit more the labeling and the way data is being used, affordances for discoverability and prominence are designed, and so on. So that was all for me, really a very quick snapshot, but I'm happy to answer questions here or over email, and to thank my colleagues for all of the efforts in data collection and data cleaning, which was quite a collective effort.
Thank you, Catalina, for your very interesting presentation. There is no question for now in the chats. We can take one question though, before we go to the next presentation. It was all so clear, Catalina, that nobody had a question.
Or so confusing that nobody knows where to start.
Yeah, it was a lot of information indeed. But
I have a question. Yes. In fact, I have a question around the method.
Yes.
And how did you gather these data? Did you use a net scrapers, or what were your tools?
Yes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we used for the foreign platforms. So for Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus, we used web scrapers. And some of them were applied directly on the platform, but for some of the platforms that was just not possible. And so what we did was we collected also data from third-party aggregators such as Just Watch and Unogs for Netflix. And then really try to compare also with some other data from European Audiovisual Observatory in terms of numbers and that. So it was really trying to compile, the most complete and accurate number that we could find. The most difficult for this is really Netflix, because you can never get access to the full catalog. So it's really a matter of, but there we did see that the data from Unox and Just Watch was had the same amount of titles. And for the Belgian, the Flemish platforms, we really collected it manually. So we really had people going through every catalog and manually putting it together, because also we needed to find then a way to streamline the typology, because we had to deal with so much non-scripted content that was labeled in a very diverse way.
All right, thank you, Catalina. I propose we're going to the last presentation. So thanks again, Catalina. The presentation that we will follow now is from Catherine Johnson. She's Professor of Media and Communications at the University of Huddersfield, and she's internationally recognized for her research on television and the screen industries. So Catherine, I invite you to share your slides, and you're going to talk about some key questions in research on international platforms. If you still have some questions on the previous presentation, I do invite you to share them in the chat or to email our researchers, so they will be happy to answer other questions. Okay, Catherine, I can see your slides, so thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for what a fantastic symposium. It's a real privilege actually to be here closing after hearing such wonderful, interesting and stimulating presentations. And I suppose it feels like quite a challenge in some ways to talk about some of the roads ahead, because I think a lot of that has been pointed out in the research that has been presented today. But I'm going to try and rise to that challenge and set out a number of different areas that we might want to think about moving forward. When I was thinking about this presentation, I went back to thinking about my book, which I wrote back in 2018, where I was arguing that on-demand television had gone mainstream, and that seems like a rather obvious thing to say now. But one of the things that struck me in the research that I've been doing very recently is that the ways in which the COVID pandemic has helped to consolidate not only the mainstream adoption of video on demand more generally, but of subscription video on demand in particular. And we've seen that with some of the audience research presented today. I was at a presentation recently by Meijin Pro, where they presented some research that Omdia had done, looking at the global market for SVODs and demonstrating that SVODs overtook pay TV globally in 2020. And we did some research in the UK context, which found that the lockdown catalyzed a shift to SVOD across all age demographics, particularly older audiences who were often subscribing for the first time and integrating SVOD into their viewing habits. And then, of course, as we've seen in the Belgian context, and we can think about this globally, the rise of SVOD is dominated by three global players, Disney, Netflix and Amazon. They make up a third of the streaming market globally, which I think is quite an incredible figure. And that is much higher in certain countries like the US and the UK. So what I want to do today is to think about what some of the next steps might be in this field. And I'm going to sort of set out 5 priorities for future research. I'm coming at this largely in relation to thinking about television. That's where most of my research resides. But I think that some of the insights are relevant for thinking beyond television. In fact, that's one of the challenges or priorities that I'm going to be putting forward. So I'm going to start with my first insight or suggestion for a priority, which is understanding Netflix beyond VOD. So given that Netflix was the first to market, it's no surprise that academia is seemingly awash with papers and articles that examine how Netflix works and its impact on the television and wider media market. And this work is really necessary, it's really vital, and a lot of it is really exciting, as we've seen today. Yet it's vital that we shift and expand our focus beyond Netflix. And one reason why this is so important is that Netflix is actually a highly atypical subscription video on demand service. This is an argument also that Amanda Lotz has made. In fact, we need to be careful of assuming that SVOD is one thing. So if we take the top 3 global SVOD service providers as an example, we can really see the high amount of variety across those top 3. And I'm going to be drawing here on some terminology that I developed in online TV for understanding and unpacking the online TV industry. So if we start with Netflix, Netflix is what I term an online native content business, which means that its business model was developed for and within an online delivery context, and its business is focused principally and primarily on the acquisition and the production and the delivery of content to audiences. That's what makes it a content business. So it's a company that is specifically focused on the delivery of TV, and its business model depends on retaining and increasing subscribers. Disney Plus is quite a different company. The Disney Plus is a TV native. Its origins are in legacy media businesses, but like Netflix, it is a content business. One of the challenges for Disney in terms of being a TV native is that unlike Netflix, it has to manage the impact of its move into SVOD on its legacy media businesses, particularly linear distribution and intellectual property. At the same time, because it's a large media conglomerate, Disney's core business strategy, again, is quite different to Netflix's. So its core business strategy is based around building brands that it can leverage across its business segments. And actually, that doesn't change significantly with the impact of this sort of shift into more of a VOD-oriented business. And finally, we've got Amazon Prime Video. So Amazon Prime Video, like Netflix, is an online native. It's a business developed in the online world, but it's what I call a technology business. So it is a large, diversified tech business of which its media operation, and particularly its SVOD operation, is just a really small part of its business. In fact, its SVOD operation is really there primarily to support its retail and cloud computing businesses, where Amazon makes most of its revenues and operating profits, respectively. So each of these SVODs has a very different business model, which affects how they operate, how they evaluate and measure success, and the kinds of strategic decisions that they make. And this is just looking at the top 3. Of course, beyond this, this slide comes from the Omdia presentation. There are, significant numbers of other kinds of SVOD services, some of which we've been hearing about today in the Belgian context, and they come from a wide range of different companies, from PSMs to telcos to cinemas to sports companies to charities and digital startups. And then we also need to add on to that the AVOD, and this is Omdia's slide. They should also not just have AVOD, but they have BVOD here, because obviously things like iPlayer are not advertiser funded. So the AVOD and BVOD markets more generally. So studying Netflix is important, but we need to broaden our focus if we really want to understand both the SVOD market, but also the wider online video market. And I thought that Catalina's presentation just before mine really demonstrated the importance of understanding some of the different strategies and the impact that has on the kinds of content that is produced, acquired, and how it is delivered as well. Building on this sort of provocation, what this really challenges us to do is to think about how we define, or different ways in which we might define, the audiovisual market. So as we've seen, we've got highly diversified companies operating with very different business models, but competing with each other, but in quite complex ways. So competing with each other for audiences, but not always for revenue, sometimes for revenue, but not always, and sometimes for content, but not always. So there's a number of different questions we need to ask here. What's the nature of the competition between different players? So myself, Amanda Lotz, and Anna Potter have done some research recently looking at that question in relation to the UK, Australian, and US markets. The nature of the competition, it varies between different players, but also in different markets. So what kinds of market power are being enacted by whom and how, and what changes need to be made to policy designed to manage markets from competition law to public service regulation and beyond. And we saw some interesting presentations around that with AV-MSD. I think in order to move forward in trying to define and understand what the audiovisual market is, we need more comparative research. And I think there's a number of different facets to this. I think we need to see more comparison across video on demand and legacy media. One of the problems I feel with some of the emphasis on Netflix is that it is focusing on the difference between Netflix and legacy media, but actually we're talking about an audiovisual market in which the boundaries between VOD and legacy media, both in terms of what they're delivering, audience experiences, industry and business strategies, are highly blurred. So we need to move beyond studying VOD as if it operates separately from legacy media, industry services, and in terms of audience behaviours. We need to increase the comparison of research that we're doing across national boundaries. So we need to understand how video on demand is developing in different contexts, and the detailed research that we've had today on the Flemish context is really important. And it would be great to think about how we might expand that research out across international comparison, but also transnational comparison to understand the international and transnational dynamics at play. And then I think we need comparison across different types of media to understand the differences and similarities in the ways in which these changes play out across these different sectors, and the ways in which different sectors might intertwine or be codependent in important ways. So Herbert Lotz and Marshall have done some work around this in terms of music, film and television. I think we also need to be thinking about news, press and journalism, music, gaming and so on. And I think one of the ways forward for doing this work is through drawing on some of the work on platformization. And here I'm sort of echoing where Tim opened the symposium today. I think platformization offers a really useful frame for situating media within wider platform ecosystems. And there's some really fantastic work here. I've just pulled out two really good examples, but there's a lot more excellent work that's going on in this area. We need to recognize that platformization is impacting all aspects of society, including audiovisual markets. I'm particularly interested in the moment in understanding the impact of platformization on public service media. There are a number of facets here, and again, Tim did touch on some of these in his opening talk. I've just pulled out a few. I think, perhaps most broadly, public service media are now operating in online infrastructures where the rules of the game are set by a small number of transnational commercial platforms like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. In relation to advertising, we need to think about and address the dominance of Google and Facebook over online advertising and what that means for public service media organizations that are dependent on broadcast advertising for all or a significant proportion of their revenues. We need to think about the impacts of datafication that is increasingly driving the work of public service media organizations, and what the costs or benefits of that might be to the social and cultural remits of public service media organizations, including some of the issues of diversity that Axel was so importantly raising for us today. And I think beyond that, we need to recognise from a regulatory perspective that public service media regulation is tied up with wider questions of platform regulation. And this is a significant challenge, I think, in terms of the regulatory context, because it means that public service media regulation needs to be considered in areas where it might not have been considered before, that some of the boundaries that exist around different forms of regulation are breaking down, and those things might need to be considered more broadly. Obviously, one of the core areas that we've touched on today in relation to some of this public service media regulation has been focused around discoverability and prominence. And this has been particularly important to debates about the legitimacy of public service media But these issues of discoverability and prominence extend beyond public service media, and there's been some really interesting and important literature emerging exploring the importance of exposure diversity, interfaces, algorithms, and the economics of discoverability and prominence of audiovisual content in the platform age. And we've been exploring this area in terms of a larger project at the University of Huddersfield that we've been terming Roots to Content. What I find so important about this body of work and the debates around it is that it centers the experience of engaging with audiovisual content. I think television studies and film studies as well has a tendency to focus on programs and on production alongside wider macroeconomic, industrial, political and regulatory factors. And don't get me wrong, these are all really vital areas, and they're areas that I'm hugely committed to and I research in. But I think that what is often overlooked has been the actual point at which viewers experience television, the television services and technologies themselves. Compared to the work on programs, for example, there's relatively little that's been written about specific television channels, just to give an example. And I really feel that SVOD, the research on SVOD has kind of actually catalyzed or been a catalyst for us thinking about challenging that. And it's put the sort of service, as I call it in online TV, of television a little bit more center stage. And so there's some great work emerging about the environments within which people encounter television and revealing these as vital sites for research. So I'm thinking about Ramon Labarte's work on smart TV sets, his work with Dave Hesmondhaug on set-top boxes. I've done some work myself on apps and on channels, Hannah Bruin's work on the schedule. This is just to mention a few of, I think, a really, really exciting and growing area of research. And this brings me to my final point, which is the importance and the place of audience research. So shifting focus onto the experience of television demands not only an analysis of interfaces, algorithms, technologies, and the industrial, economic and political forces that shape them, but also the experiences of viewers themselves. And I'm inspired here by recent calls for returns to audience studies within and beyond television from the likes of Jonathan Gray, from Das and Itraana, also Graham Turner. And one of the things that I think has come out of that, and here I really accord with Graham Turner's recent writing in this area, is that to understand the changing experience of TV in the platform age, we need to return to and build on some of the audience studies work from the 1980s and 1990s that examined television and everyday life, the likes of Silverstone, Morley and Lull, for example. And what this body of work was so pioneering in setting out was the value of studying audiences, not just to understand processes of meaning making, so how people make sense of text, which is very important, but also to understand how viewing practices are shaped and are shaping everyday life. And we've been taking some steps into this area with our Roots to Content project by examining how people find and decide what to watch, which is surprisingly overlooked body of research. We've been undertaking qualitative interviews, we've been doing some observation work in people's homes before the pandemic, and more recently we've been developing some survey work. And at the heart of this really is an argument that it's vital to understand not only what people watch, but how they discover and access that content. And this involves situating television in relation to wider media use and wider socio-cultural dynamics. So this is my summary of the points that I feel are really exciting next steps in terms of future research. And I hope that these provide a useful stepping off point for discussion and debate as we bring together what's been a really fantastic symposium. I'd love to hear what you think the research priorities might be, and also what challenges they might pose as well. So thank you very much again for a great symposium, for inviting me to speak today. I'm looking forward to your questions. You can also email me or tweet me as well if you have any questions or thoughts about these future priorities. And I look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for your very interesting presentation and your ideas on future research. I already have a question in the chat from Hannah Bruin. BVODs in the UK, how are they doing at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. That's quite a big question. they are being challenged quite significantly by the SVODs. Particularly what we've seen in the UK was really the dominance of iPlayer, which was really early to market and had a really, really dominant position, which has gradually been declining since Netflix entered the market. And then when Disney entered the market, the beginning of March last year, Disney was really, really rapidly, hugely successful, and SVOD in general just really increased over the pandemic. We have seen some improvement. So iPlayer was allowed from 2019 to increase the amount of time that content could stay on iPlayer. So it's got a lot more content that's staying for a year or more, and that has definitely improved the use of iPlayer. So I think there is some hope in that regard, but it's a massively unequal market, no doubt about it.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Jacob Nielsen, and he's telling us that he uses your book in his teaching, and he recognizes and appreciates the distinctions between content natives, TV natives, and online natives. But one thing about the typology doesn't quite sit well with him. Defining, for example, Disney Plus and Paramount Plus as TV native does not quite do justice to the underlying corporate nature and history of Disney Plus and Paramount Plus, for instance, and the underlying corporate move towards vertical integration 2.0. In short, why not call them, for example, film natives or another term?
It's a really fantastic question, and I could give a really cheeky and provocative answer and say, well, you know, film is TV, really, isn't it? So let's call them TV natives. But I'm joking when I give that answer, really. But I think it's a really important question. When I first developed the typology, I wanted to use the term legacy media, which is quite widely used, and so use sort of the sort of media or audiovisual media or screen or something like that. When I first started presenting that, I got quite a lot of pushback about the use of the term legacy. And it really made me think about the fact, and I make that argument in the book, that when we're talking about legacy, it's, well, legacy where and in what way? So in some ways, Amazon is a legacy internet company. So that was why I sort of shifted to the notion of natives, which other people have recently also suggested there's some issues around that, and I'm completely open with that. In terms of my book, I was thinking specifically about about television. So I think it would be absolutely fine to take some of the concepts and ideas and think about or use the terminology of film natives if you're focusing or shifting more onto that perspective of film. Or one of the things that I've been thinking about recently in relation to that book is about expanding. What if we look more widely just across the online video market in general? So we move away from the distinction between some of the sort of social media content, film content, and so on that I was quite interested in exploring in that book. Then maybe we have sort of audiovisual natives and online natives or something like that. So as I say in the book, the terminologies were not designed to be sort of set in stone. They were designed to be tools for thinking with. So I'm kind of quite pleased by your question, actually, because I think it's demonstrating that the ways that the tools invite us to think about the fact that actually the distinctions that we have often held between film and television for 50 years, 60 years, actually are not right? They don't hold. Disney has been a film and a television company for a long, long time. So thank you so much for your question.
Thank you for your answer. We have 3 questions in the chat, but I don't think we can answer them all in time, but I'll give priority to our guests. So Tim, you can do the wrap up, but I'm going to go to Antonio Castañera's question. He says, by your perspective, will there be space for BVOD only at a local level or at an international level too? Or the local broadcasters, BVODs have to merge like BritBox?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think it is the question that is on, you know, is in everybody's minds really. And I think that it probably depends on a few different things. It depends on whether we're talking about commercial viability. And so we're talking about commercial video on demand services, or whether we're talking about PSM legitimacy. So in terms of the fundamental argument is how big an audience or how many subscribers or viewers do broadcasters need to continue to get to remain either financially viable or to remain legitimate to justify receiving public funds or other kinds of sort of special regulatory obligations. So in some ways, I think there's a political argument there about to what extent will governments and publics accept funding PSM's BVOD services if they're getting significantly lower than the SVODs. And that's a kind of political argument. And then I think if not, then there are questions about what the strategies are. In the UK, there's been some political calls for a combined one combined PSM VOD service. It's really challenging though, because they all have different funding models, they have very clear brand identities and different public service remits. So how do you fulfill all of those within one? BritBox is interesting and seems to be having some limited success, but I would question the ability for BritBox to really break through in any significant way because of the sort of legacy media issues that come with it. So that it is being produced by public service companies in the UK who still have commitments to provide that content free to air and on their free broadcaster video on demand services. So I don't have an answer, and I think that it's hugely challenging, and I really do think that it's going to depend on the politics, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Tim, do we have time for one more question, or are we going to wrap up? One more question, great. I'll take the question from Mats Andersen. He's also congratulating you with your excellent work. And one of his questions is, why are many TV streaming services seemingly struggling with branding their service clearly? And why do they crowd around mainstream audiences instead of differentiating themselves by going more clear audience segments?
That's a really great question. And I worked with a great company called Red Bee Media, who are the leading UK company for branding in the broadcast market. And this is one of the arguments that they make, that a lot of the VOD services look exactly the same. The interfaces look the same. There is very, very little brand differentiation. And their argument is that there needs to be that embrace of brand differentiation at the interface level, or at all levels really. And I think that it's probably a feature of in some instances in a relatively new market where there's the need to kind of work out and try out different strategies. And so if you're risk averse, you copy the really successful ones. So I think that's probably part of what it is. I think that the challenge in terms of the smaller VOD services is really visibility, and there we get to those debates about prominence and discoverability. So being able to cut through for audiences just even know that you exist, and that I think brings us back to the platformization sets of research and sets of questions, because the fact of the matter is that discoverability is really controlled by the small major global platforms when we're talking about things like apps. And without some regulatory intervention in that area, it's going to remain really hard for small VOD service, both public service ones, but also digital startups and ones from cinemas and museums and so on, to really cut through in the market.
All right, thank you, Catherine, for your interesting answers. a lot of details and nuance there, which is very much needed. I'll give the floor to Tim now to do a little wrap up, although Frank Vervaken has another question, but maybe Catherine, I will forward that to you and then you can answer that. So Tim, the floor is yours.
All right. Yeah, I'll keep it very short. I think there's a lot to digest and we still have to go for lunch, but we had quite a busy morning. I'm very thankful to all the participants that joined today. I'm also very thankful for all the questions you've asked and all the interesting remarks you made. We would like to take this discussion further, and so we are very open for exchanging data, dialogue, remarks, discussions with other international scholars. So please reach out to us. We'll also, from the moment we're allowed to present at conferences, we'll present more insights of ongoing PhD research and ongoing applied research. One more special thanks for Kathy Johnson again for being willing to do this and to close the lecture. Then thanks to all the speakers from SMIT, all the researchers. Thanks to Amanda Lazzaroni and Juan Vasquez for the technical support. And finally, thanks for all our supporters, VUB, FAO, the VRT chair, and all others, Flemish government, Minister of Media, and all institutions that find this type of research important enough to fund it. So thanks a lot. Have a nice rest of the week and see you soon. Bye-bye.